In 2011, the U.S. Department of Education issued a mandate to post-secondary educational institutions regarding their handling of allegations of sexual misconduct among students. The department's guidelines required these institutions to create their own pseudo-justice system wherein allegations would be investigated and hearings held. The standards laid out by the department were a naked attack on students' right to due process, dictating broad definitions for types of misconduct that stretched far beyond the legal definitions the criminal justice system uses, and laying out a systematic denial of the due process rights of accused students. In the legal chaos created by the concept of an accuser's automatic victim status and, quote, right to be believed, many students, mostly young men, have seen their academic careers interrupted or even ended by mere allegations from fellow students. HBR Talk with Hannah Wallen. Institutions all over the United States had responded to the 2011 Dear Colleague letter with changes to policy and procedures that resulted in disciplinary actions over which hundreds of students sued their universities. Title9forall.com is currently tracking 627 of these lawsuits. The site contains a database of these lawsuits, along with a list of helpful organizations or individuals for students experiencing discrimination and a list of distinguished due process attorneys. There have been rulings in federal court indicating that the Dear Colleague standards and the policies they inspired created violations of students' constitutionally protected civil rights. In one ruling that dramatically contradicted the Dear Colleague guidelines, the Sixth Circuit held that in conducting Title IX investigations, colleges and universities are required to provide parties an opportunity to cross-examine witnesses in the presence of a neutral fact finder in cases hinging on the credibility of such witnesses. In another, the court found that an accused student was deprived of due process rights when university administrators suspended him without first holding an official hearing. If anything, these rulings have made it clear that the Dear Colleague standards cannot remain in place as an unaltered policy because they contain unconstitutional requirements. Trump administration Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, upon accepting her appointment to the office, vowed reform. In late 2018, extending into January 2019, her office accepted commentary from citizens regarding the topic. Last year, she released a set of proposed changes intended to restore due process and protect students' freedom of speech, sending feminists into a panic as her new updated guidelines were set to roll back or dramatically alter several points of the 2011 Dear Colleague guidance. Completely ignoring the fact that the 2011 rules were a huge departure from the real court system's response to criminal allegations, the National Organization for Women accused DeVos of wanting to turn the government's response to assault, harassment, and rape upside down, and openly lamented the impending loss of, quote, victims' rights. Unfazed by feminist melodrama, on Wednesday, May 6th, Secretary DeVos's office formally announced the new rules. Robbie Suave, writing for Reason.com, stated, "The new rules are similar to what the Department of Education proposed in November of 2018. Most notably, the government has abolished the single investigator model, which previously permitted a sole university official to investigate an accusation of misconduct, decide which evidence to consider, and produce a report recommending an outcome. Under new rules, the final decision-maker must be a different person than the investigator, and a finding of responsibility can only be rendered after a hearing in which a representative for the accused is able to pose questions to the accuser, i.e., cross-examination. Importantly, the new rules narrow the scope of actionable sexual harassment to exclude conduct that ought to be protected under the First Amendment. Obama-era guidance had defined sexual harassment as, quote, any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, end quote. The new rules keep this definition, but add that the conduct must be offensive to a reasonable person, severe, and pervasive. In practice, this should mean that schools will no longer initiate Title IX investigations that impugn free speech. The new rules will also end the pernicious practice of universities initiating Title IX investigations in cases where the alleged victims are not interested in this course of action. On May 7th, the National Organization for Women published a press release calling the new guidelines an all-out attack on the safety of women and girls. Their article begins with the theatrical line, "We don't see you. We don't hear you. We don't believe you." That's the message Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos is sending off with the sweeping new changes to Title IX. And it only gets worse from there, lamenting that the DeVos guidelines are set in law rather than just tied by policy to schools' funding, labeling long-standing due process standards new rights, and calling the changes draconian. Democrat presidential candidate Joe Biden disavowed the new guidelines, claiming in a statement quoted by Politico that the new rules, quote, shame and silence survivors and give colleges a green light to ignore sexual violence and strip survivors of their rights. He has vowed to put a quick end to these changes if elected. The article goes on to quote Biden, who has recently vehemently denied a sexual assault allegation against himself by former aide Tara Reade, as stating that survivors deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and when they step forward, they should be heard, not silenced. While Biden thinks it is an attack on survivors for universities to carefully scrutinize allegations against their students, regarding his own case, he stated that accuser stories should be subject to appropriate inquiry and scrutiny, and that when reporting on this particular allegation, responsible news organizations should examine and evaluate the full and growing record of inconsistencies in her story, a benefit he would not get from campus investigators if he were a student facing the same allegation from a fellow student under Obama-era guidelines. The feminist response to this has been quite interesting. There doesn't seem to be anywhere near the same degree of outrage leveled at presidential candidate Biden over this allegation as there was leveled at Donald Trump over his flippant remark about the variability of women's sensibilities regarding men's sexual pursuit, depending on the subject's wealth and popularity. In fact, some feminists have even followed up statements that they believe Biden's accuser, which under today's standards would mean they view Biden as a confirmed rapist, with declarations that they support his candidacy anyway. But they still oppose DeVos's Title IX reforms because screw men and their due process rights if they can't wheel and deal federal funding for feminist initiatives in return for feminist political support. Biden's history of garnering feminist support by opposing the due process rights of other men accused of sexual misconduct is long-standing and consistent. During his current campaign, he has bragged about his part as a co-author of the Violence Against Women Act of 1994, Title IV of the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994. In 1993, he cited the work of RadFem professor Mary P. Koss in support of the passage of his bill. VAWA included multiple attacks on due process and the gender neutrality of federal intimate partner and sexual violence law. The law used wording that relies on the label victim for accusers throughout its text, presuming accuser stories to be factual and the accused to be perpetrators, thereby removing the presumption of innocence. This is normal for statutes describing criminal definitions, but VAWA does so in its descriptions of policy and procedures for criminal investigations and hearings, and federally funded social services for accusers whose alleged perpetrators haven't been convicted. Under VAWA, federal funding was allocated for indoctrinating every aspect of the justice system with feminist dogma, prejudicing them against the accused. Further, federal funding was allocated to incentivize arrest, prosecution, conviction, and sentencing without regard to the merits or dubiousness of individual allegations. The law funded advocates to accompany accusers to court, creating a government-supported adversary against the accused that is unique to these types of criminal allegations. This advocate's job is to support the accuser's interests against the due process rights of the accused and to provide emotional support throughout the judicial process. The accused is not given any equivalent support. Under the law Biden brags about penning, the law enforcement and judicial systems are essentially ordered to approach criminal sexual misconduct allegations with a presumption of guilt and then cripple the defense of the accused. Yet, when accused of such misconduct himself, Biden expects the full benefit of the doubt from you peons whose due process rights he eviscerated with that law. In all of his statements on Reade's allegations against him and his opinion of DeVos's Title IX reforms, Biden has yet to explain why he thinks he is deserving of a better level of civil rights protections than you are. In fact, to date, while it's been posed rhetorically by some of the right-leaning media, he hasn't even directly faced that question from anybody. Will anyone in the establishment media have the courage to ask him? Does the presidential candidate have the courage to be interviewed by someone who would? HBR Talk is unlikely to get the opportunity, but we do have the chance to explore issues surrounding DeVos' Title IX reforms, the current political response to them, and Joe Biden's tightrope act between his feminist narratives on sexual violence and his response to his accuser. The discussion streams on multiple platforms. You can tune in Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Eastern via the link in the low bar, or find other viewing and listening options for that time or later on badgerfeed.com.